Ideas, the show where we look at misfires, mistakes, and miscalculations from all throughout history.
I'm Tony Southcott.
And I'm Albert Berg, and today's Bad Idea is brought to you by our featured patron, Philip Ripper.
Thank you, Philip.
Tony's got the bad idea for us this week. Tony, what are we learning about?
I know this is going to be horribly surprising to you, but it's another one that deals with some communism.
Hey, I've got some good... You just hit capitalism with Fordlandia. I'm about to hit them next week with to be announced episode, so we can play both sides of the fence. There's corruption on either end.
Yeah, and this one is actually going to be showing corruption on both sides very, very blatantly. We're talking about the Albanian Ponzi Civil War.
And we've heard about somebody named Ponzi in a bad idea before. Is this the same Ponzi?
This is not the same Ponzi, but it is the same type of scheme.
Wait, so a different guy named Ponzi also did a Ponzi scheme?
No, they just named it the Ponzi scheme. That's what these are called.
Okay.
It's like pyramid schemes and things like that. There's a few different types of pyramid schemes. A type of pyramid scheme is a Ponzi scheme, whenever it's directly related towards investment money instead of a product.
So this is the sequel without the original actor in it called Ponzi Legacy.
Yes, because he was dead for a long time, because this was 1997, and I think Ponzi was in the early 1900s.
That was your episode. I don't remember, but that was my impression.
Yeah, I'm just trying to remember the exact years. I want to say it was like the 20s or something like that. But memory fades. Anyway, when faced with the terrors of communism and capitalism, this podcast has been almost unilaterally in favor of the free market, of a person's ability to choose their fate for better or worse, and to do as they will to work their own profits. When Albania was finally able to shed the yoke of being a communist satellite state, we watched in wonder as they dove headlong into unbridled, unregulated, and uneducated capitalism. In some ways, it was the dream. The people of Albania were finally able to chase down the taste of Western civilization, of which they had never really been able to witness out of just small glimpses. This was a country that was very underdeveloped at the time. Even in the 90s, people were drawing horses with carts. There were very sparse utilities, not great power grids. It was everything you would expect from a Soviet satellite state. And most of the people lived here on less than $50 per month. The idea that the state had little to no say over their actions and the market economy was intoxicating. It was going to allow them to take control of all these things in their lives. Unfortunately for the people of Albania, it was also a time where every scam artist, out-of-country investor, and mafioso all of a sudden had the same freedom that they did.
Yeah, there it is. It doesn't work if you don't trust people.
Or in this case, they trust way too much.
I guess that also. If people aren't trustworthy, it doesn't work. You gotta have some regulation. Yep. Sorry to say, guys.
In 1992, the first democratic elections were held in Albania, and Salih Berisha became president. This cardiologist turned politician would have to oversee not only the rebuilding of a nation, but also the mindset that comes from switching to a Stalinistic command-based society into a market-based one. Being that the state provided everything it could for the people before, I can only imagine how difficult the transition must have been, how hopeful it would be, and also terrifying. This is a huge part of the reason why these scams succeeded. People had such little context for the way interest worked with banks, and they also had no regulation at all over Ponzi schemes. The central bank decided that they weren't going to insure investments in banks. It was something that, because of the age and basically how their economy worked at the time, they did not have the backing to be able to have like the FCC or something like that watching these sorts of investments. It was suggested by the International Monetary Fund that for now they just kind of eschew that and ignore it. The IMF did not see what was coming, though.
It sounds like what we're going to get is all of the problems that you could have all at once with the capitalist system. Like when you're in a system in the West, in the United States, where it's been going on for 200 years, there have been many course corrections that we've been able to take. When banks have failed, we have adjusted and said, oh, maybe that doesn't work so well. When people have been dishonest about things, we've adjusted things. Yes, we've said, let's put some hedges against that kind of problem in. And people can debate about how far you want to go. You don't want to restrict things so much that you can't have growth. But on the other hand, going into all of this blind without having a progressive series of failures sets you up to have, it sounds like, all the failures at the same time.
Yeah, and especially whenever you don't have a natural skepticism for people trying to scam you. Like, just from
I don't buy that.
It
can't have been that idyllic beforehand.
That's true.
Where nobody would steal your stuff ever.
Yeah, it's like, I'm sure everybody was fighting for like a little more food, a little more this, a little more that. It wasn't entirely that there was no such thing as property and everybody got along kumbaya. Maybe
it was, Tony. I can imagine the more socialist-leaning people listening to our podcast being very annoyed with your, let's say, proclivities.
Yes. That's okay.
Your bias is on display.
And just to review, a Ponzi scheme, like all pyramid schemes, starts out whenever you have somebody at the top who is collecting money from other people and is making huge promises on the types of returns you're going to make. Sometimes it's like 10%. In these cases, it jumped over 100% per month for some of the claims that they were planning to give back. So people would get their money, they would put it back in, then they would get the money back after a month and reinvest it and reinvestment and reinvestment. But they weren't actually making anything. They were just using the new money that was coming in from other people to pay off the other people. And that's essentially how a Ponzi scheme works. And whenever you get a run of these, you have the entire Ponzi scheme go crashing down, and it's revealed that there was no real money being made for anybody, except for the people that are usually fleeing the country whenever it starts to go on that run. The first few of these started out pretty simple. Hajin Sedche from Kosovo started right after the fall in 1991 to gather investments from people. He offered about 15% per month in returns, which, if you ever get that, it's an amazing return. Like, that is a too good to be true, especially in 1 month type return. If you get that in a year, it's often because the economy is just booming and you had a few really good ones. But when you dangle that much return in front of anybody in a single month, it starts to override that voice saying that it's too good to be true. Other organizations would end up making 15% seem much more paltry. Like I said, several got up to 100% per month on these returns.
It's good money if you can make it.
Yeah, if you're like the first couple months in there and then just never go back. Sedchi said that his plan was to use the money to build a luxury hotel in Tirana, the capital, while still giving those returns before a single shovel of dirt had been moved. It looked like he actually had plans to do some of this, and instead he just took the money and moved to Switzerland.
Is this a situation where it's like a stock price? Because you can have a stock go way up without anything actually happening. People just have to think this is going to... Like, who is reporting these values?
That's basically just the bank reporting itself. But yeah, it was mostly like you buy a voucher and you come back in a month and you get double, and then they strongly suggest you just reinvest that so it doesn't leave their ecosystem. And you keep doing that over and over again. Somehow this particular pyramid scheme hurt less than most of the other ones you'll ever hear about in history, because Sedche came back and returned the base investment to the people that he had gotten it from. He didn't give them any of their interests. He just gave the money back. It was a very weird situation, one that I've never seen as far as a Ponzi scheme where somebody just kind of relented and paid people back. It was bizarre to read about. I couldn't even find exactly how he was able to do that without losing a lot of the money, but it was very, very strange.
I love the fact that this guy tried to do the right thing, at least as far as I can tell at this point in the story, is just like messing with your head. Like, wait, how? How can people not just take the money and run?
Yeah, it's like maybe he actually did want to build those buildings and just couldn't do it, so he returned the money. That's not how bad investments work. I don't know. It was, like I said, I was trying to find more information on this guy, and it's a little bit sparse out there, like to find information on a random Albanian investor.
Maybe he just wasn't practiced up on the best way to rip people off yet. He's like, wait a minute, I'm supposed to keep it? God,
or he just had a conscience.
This capitalism stuff is so complicated.
People are actually like, how do you sleep at night? And he's like, I don't. I have to return it all. The next three major Ponzi schemes would be much more nefarious. The Suja Group was made by a shoe factory worker, and then the Populi Foundations were run by opposition politicians to the main regime. The Rappers Zafiri Group also popped up, and these basically were just three clones of each other, all of them offering that 100% return, setting up banks all over the place where people could come and just deposit the money. And people really took notice, especially when some of those first few months of returns started to get out there, and people were seeing that if they sold a chunk of their farm, they could go and they could double their money in a month. And it started getting those really huge runs in where people were just dumping money hand over fist to get in there.
You know what this reminds me of? This reminds me of a lot of This reminds me of the scams or bubbles that we saw related to the New World, where people in the Old World are like, there's a whole new land out there. You can't say that there's not giant piles of gold just sitting around waiting for people to cart it back, right?
Like, there's got to at least be something.
Sure. Since these people are in uncharted territory, they're like, yeah, I guess people are just making 100% on investment every month. They tried to tell us capitalism was good, but we didn't know it was this good.
Thousands on thousands of people would sell their land, their clothes, their everything, just hoping to get a little bit more into these banks. Some towns were said to look like ranches as people brought their entire livestock and started selling it in the street just so they would have a little bit more to put in. This Ponzi scheme grew big enough that the average person invested more than $400 in them. And that's the entire per capita. Like there's 1.5 million people in Albania at the time, and the average person was putting about $400, which is like 8 months worth. There were a lot of people putting more than that. But in the end, 80% of the total GDP of the country would be involved in these Ponzi schemes.
80%?
80%. So 80% of every dollar made in the entire country would end up in these Ponzi banks, or over the course of a couple of years. That's how big these things got.
I can see where maybe things aren't going to turn out so well here.
This is when the International Monetary Fund was starting to be like, you guys got a problem coming, and we don't know how to fix it. Also, these weren't the only banks that were going at the time. It's just that Albanians weren't very interested in that 3% interest rate. They were starting to thrive in a lot of ways, in ways they hadn't before. They had construction going on. They had a lot of really cool stuff happening. But these Ponzi schemes just completely undermined any progress that they were about to have, especially whenever they saw this run coming. The World Bank and the International Monetary Fund were brought in to assist with these legitimate banks, but it takes years to set up the capital and to get things moving properly, especially in a state that had zero private holdings for over 45 years. The transition was going to be sloppy, and none of the institutions that protect people from Ponzi schemes had been enacted at all. At the time, President Berisha had a 90% majority over the last election, although some people say that it might have been a rigged election. It seemed like he was legitimately popular, so it's hard to tell with that one. It was always the opposition party that was just like, we're gonna protest this, and we're not gonna participate, and they didn't seem to really understand what was happening with the election, it seemed like. But to get a 90% majority in anything seems a little bit I'm a little skeptical of that.
But that doesn't mean he wouldn't have won anyway. That's one of those weird, maybe he would have still done well. You can't know from this distance with our level of knowledge.
And as he was getting reelected again, one of his advisors was telling him about the Ponzi schemes and how things were going to break, and that he needed to address this before it became a big problem, so he had that guy jailed and put away for a while.
Shoot that messenger. Get him before he tells anybody else.
Yeah, that was the main thing. He didn't want any more things to undermine what was happening while they were in a situation that looked like a good economy. In January of 1997, a few particularly strong runs on the withdrawal shocked the Zafari and Populi firms. A run is when a lot of people demand their money back from a bank, and this can be devastating to legitimate banks. So if you have, say, in the Great Depression, nobody has confidence in their banks, they all go and they get their money. A lot of these banks end up shutting down and not everybody gets their money back. Now make it so that you basically just have imaginary money and you're running out of the money to pay back the normal investors, and how fast that entire thing can collapse. So when Zafari and Populi completely just ran out, there was a full-on disaster. On the 22nd of January 1997, the government shut these banks down and seized what little assets they had left, leaving an entire country missing out on basically everything that they owned. Like I said, we were talking about 80% of their entire GDP locked into these types of banks.
So what happens? Are these people literally taking the money and running, who are running these schemes? Or is it just the people who get on the run early that manage to get out with some of what they invested and everybody else is left holding the bag, or what?
It's pretty much that. The people that were running these banks, the higher ups, most of them got charged in absentia because they weren't able to get sent back to Albania. So they just got away with millions and millions of dollars. You're talking about around 1.5 billion to 2 billion in total funds taken. And they weren't really able to recover much of that. 2 days later, furious protesters marched into Lushna And it was the de facto beginning of the Albanian Rebellion. Taking on their totalitarian designs, the government did not grant the right to protest. Essentially, the government decided they were going to stop this through silence, they weren't going to allow any sort of demonstrations, and that they were going to try to keep this as quiet as possible.
Who are you keeping it quiet from? Everybody already knows they're broke. What is it like? Don't embarrass us in front of the United States, guys. Just pretend like you still have money and smile.
But with the amount of money that was gone, that was just not even going to be an option. During public broadcasts in which the government claimed it would not use force, it crushed the opposition under fire hoses, brute force, and basically went into a bunch of towns where they had peaceful protests, especially like hunger strikes that were starting up, and got into some pretty severe clashes. In what might have been the point of no return for outright rebellion, 9 students in a town called Vlora were killed.
9 or 90?
9. In retaliation, angry mobs from Vlora burned down the police station and many government buildings. Then someone had the bright idea to go rob the armories and weapons depots around the city. This was very uncharacteristic for Albania, who even through the fall of communism didn't have violent protests or civil unrest. It had been sort of a maudlin transition from one government to the next, not the firebomb variety. One thing I noticed that most of the weapons depots were abandoned and were free to be looted. Like the soldiers either were against their government or were too afraid of being firebombed and abandoned their posts, and I'm not sure which. I couldn't find that information. But this would lead to about 656,000 guns, 1.5 billion rounds of ammunition, 3.5 million hand grenades, and 1 million landmines being stolen from army depots and being in the hands of civilians.
So this civil war, I guess you're going to get into it more, but it sounds like it's mostly just a government overthrow. There's not necessarily, from what I can tell, 2 groups that are opposing each other. I mean, the government counts as a group, and they're going to try to defend themselves, but is there like a group of citizens that's really excited about the fact that they lost a bunch of money in all these Ponzi schemes?
There are some odd, like, kind of faction groups. There are these coalitions. They were called Salvation Committees, and they basically were unified against the main government more than anything else. It wasn't something where it was a unified front, and a lot of this stuff also turned into gangs fighting each other in cities and killing each other in mass quantities because they were the ones that just all of a sudden had the weaponry. So this was a rebellion that was also just huge civil unrest. Not all of the gangs cared about the government or anything like that. They cared about what they could get for themselves.
So they just take the opportunity of, hey, lots of guns. The government obviously sucks and is going to fall. There's a power vacuum. Let's fill it.
Yeah, they basically usurped government services in a lot of areas and just took what they wanted. These days were known as the Lead Nights, in which minor insurrections popped up all over the country. President Berisha actually managed to nab his 3rd term during all of this turmoil, but every opposition party completely boycotted the elections, so it's a kind of classical misunderstanding of the democratic process if you're running unopposed. The chaos bred many opportunities for enterprising individuals, such as a group that took an anti-tank vehicle to one of Albania's treasuries and stole about $6 million in gold. This has been called the greatest robbery in Balkans history, and I kind of wish that it had a movie about it. None of these people ever got caught.
Wow.
Armed groups of young men, fed up poor, started to lash out. They would fire indiscriminately into the night and raided whatever they felt they needed. They formed coalitions, one of which would actually topple parts of the sitting government in most of the cities around. We covered this a little bit. Like, there's never a point where Bashir gets completely taken out of office, but he's definitely being undermined in every other city, and there was an attempt on his life where somebody threw dynamite at him.
Oh, let's go. Talking about early, like, going through all of the problems at once. It's going back to the anarchists of the early 1900s. I guess 1920s is when the big dynamiting stuff was a real big one.
Yeah.
A big problem.
I imagine just all of a sudden having, like, stable dynamite definitely changed the game for that. It would be much, much scarier.
People were horrified. It was literally like, what are we going to do now that dynamite exists? Because early on, there was no protection against anything like that because people weren't planning for it up until dynamite came around. So somebody parked a carriage. This is still in the days when horse-drawn carriages were a thing, in front of a bank, and it was just full of dynamite, and they blew the whole thing up. Sort of
anything left money-wise?
I don't think... I'm sure that there was monetary loss, but I'm pretty sure many people died also.
Yeah, that's
so
insane.
that was the part of the story that I read. I'll have to look into how much dollars were burned up.
There were some infighting between groups that were vehemently anti-communist and communist, but the thing that brought them together was basically their hate for the current government. That's whenever they turned into a singular salvation committee with the intent to overthrow Berisha. It was at this point that the UN decided to get involved because Berisha was obviously not able to control his own country, to have his troops stop these multiple insurrections across the entirety of Albania. They created Operation Alba, and about 7,000 well-trained troops from Italy, France, and other Slavic countries came in to restore order. This multinational group seems to have done a very good job because they didn't take that long to completely retake the capital, and they quelled a lot of these insurrections. There wasn't a lot of bloodshed in that. There was a lot of total bloodshed in these gang wars. More than 2,000 people did end up dying because of the gang wars that happened here. But thankfully, whenever they came back in with major troops that were actually well armed, a lot of those people lost the will to really keep fighting and to defend their gang-controlled cities against the UN. And this is basically April 1997, so we've been in the middle of this insurrection since January. Things are beginning to look a little bit better. By July of 1997, Berisha would be ousted from office. There was a good chance he was going to resign anyway because he didn't want to work with the opposition party at all. He thought that they had no place in government, but he ended up just getting ousted. The new person went in, who was a democratic socialist, and they started to finally get these monetary policies in order and dig themselves out of this giant rut that they had built themselves into. Albania may be a small country, but it is currently thriving. It has joined NATO and is trying to work its way into the European Union. It has a lot of the really nice free travel things that you can do whenever you're inside the EU, but it's not an official country in there yet. And I was surprised looking at some of these things, from what it looked like in 97 compared to now. It's a very, very pretty, their capital is very pretty. Everything is very updated, and it's cool to see a country like this go from in the 90s barely having horses and carriages and just bad buses and everything to what it is now. So I'm glad that Albania was able to recover from this, but this was one of the only times I've ever heard of a Ponzi scheme actually causing a war, and that's kind of what drew me to this.
So what is it, if you're having a time machine, let's say, and you can go back to before all of this kicks off, what do you think could have been done to help ease Albania into more freedom without breaking everything? Is there a strategy you could take? Because you can't just tell people, don't try to steal money, because there's always some jerks out there who are going to try to steal money because that's how people are.
I think you would have to focus on heavy, heavy consequences and oversight for that sort of theft. You would immediately out the gate have to have deposits insured to a certain amount of money so people could feel secure in a banking system, as well as just maybe use some of that whole, it's the Wild West out here, there's not a lot of laws, let's hang some bad bankers type people.
Oh, I see. So go the other way with the Wild West.
Yes. Just make sure that if somebody's scamming that many people, that it's very, very clear that the government's not going to support that. That's about what it would take, in my opinion anyway, for this time period to not have devolved into complete chaos.
I don't have any definitive answers, but I suspect the best course would be a gradual changeover. And I don't know how you enforce that or make that work exactly, but anything that's just a radical new system, even if you can argue that it's a good system, if people don't know how to use it and you just plunk everybody down into this new worldview that they're not used to, you're going to have a bad time.
Yeah, and there have been countries that have done it pretty well. Tanzania is interesting because my friend who lived there grew up, and one day they had their little Mao books, they had all these other things going on, and then the president said, we've been deceived and we are going to transition out of this. And basically, it was small commodities that slowly brought it in. The fact that you could all of a sudden work to get sugar and other things showed people how that economy would work, and they slowly allowed imports and slowly transitioned into a more capitalistic form of government.
So they didn't have a massive shock to the system. One day it was just suddenly new. They're like, well, we'll do this a little bit at a time.
Yeah, and I think it's also interesting whenever you have your president who was a dictator go up there and say he was wrong. So I think that counted for a little bit too. Just letting people know that this is a change that's going to happen and we're going to try to do it with as little bloodshed as possible instead of a violent insurrection. which the reason why this wasn't a violent insurrection was the fall of the USSR. So they had an opportunity for that. There was just a lot of people chomping at the bit to get into these countries and exploit what they could.
That's fascinating.
I think that's all I have on the Albanian Revolution. Thank you guys for listening to this. If you really enjoy it, check out our Patreon at patreon.com/humanechoes. We'd really appreciate it if you did that. $1, $2, $5 a month. We give you all sorts of cool swag. You get these early. You get the bonus podcast. Also, if you have ideas, send them to badideasshow@gmail.com.
And finally, if you're mad about us talking down about some douchebag communists, don't just tune in next week and we'll talk about some douchebag capitalists. Because, oh boy.
Balance. Bye, everybody.
Bye.